The Arizona desert had never felt more unforgiving than it did that summer, leaving Jackson Cole with nothing but a drought-stricken ranch and a mountain of unpaid bills. When a proposition came from Eleanor Blackwood, a 75-year-old railroad heiress with no living heirs, it seemed like divine intervention, a marriage of convenience that would save the land his family had worked for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But just 3 days after saying, "I do," Jackson uncovered a hidden vault beneath the Blackwood estate that would change everything. Sometimes salvation arrives in forms we never expect, and the greatest treasures aren't always measured in dollars and cents. Before we continue this extraordinary journey, tell us where you're tuning in from today. And if this story touches something in your soul, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly special just for you. The relentless sun beat down on Jackson Cole's weathered hat as he trudged across the parched earth of what had once been his most productive pasture. At 36, his face was already lined from years under the Arizona sun and the mounting stress of trying to keep Blue Mesa Ranch afloat. The once promising cattle operation that had been in his family for 4 generations now stood on the brink of financial ruin. Jackson paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed the cracked earth beneath his boots. The drought had stretched on for nearly 3 years now, each season worse than the last. The stock pond had shrunk to a muddy puddle, barely enough to water half his remaining herd. He'd already sold off most of his cattle at rock-bottom prices just to keep the lights on and the property taxes paid. His ranch hands, once a team of 5 loyal workers, had dwindled to just old Miguel, who refused to leave despite Jackson being months behind on his wages. "My father worked for your grandfather," Miguel had said simply when Jackson tried to let him go. "Where else would I go?" The loyalty tore at Jackson's heart almost as much as the impending failure. The distant rumble of an approaching vehicle pulled Jackson from his thoughts. He turned to see his battered pickup truck bouncing along the dirt road, Miguel behind the wheel. The old man was waving urgently, which could only mean one thing: more bad news. Jackson made his way back, his boots kicking up dust with each heavy step. By the time he reached the truck, Miguel had already stepped out, clutching a stack of official-looking papers. "They came while you were checking the south pasture," Miguel said, handing over the documents with a grim expression. From the bank, Jackson took the papers, though he hardly needed to read them to know their contents. The foreclosure notice he'd been dreading for months had finally arrived. Sunland Regional Bank had run out of patience, and with 3 missed mortgage payments, they were taking legal action to reclaim the property. 90 days, Jackson muttered, scanning the documents. "They're giving us 90 days before they take everything." Miguel removed his hat, a gesture of respect for the gravity of the moment. "What will you do, Jefe?" Jackson folded the papers and tucked them into his back pocket. "Same thing Coles have always done, Miguel. Fight like hell until the very end." But as the words left his mouth, Jackson wasn't sure he believed them anymore. Fighting required resources, money, time, options. He was running dangerously low on all 3. "Let's head back to the house," he said finally. "Day's not getting any cooler, and we've still got fences to mend on the east side." The drive back to the ranch house was silent, both men lost in their thoughts. The 2-story stone and timber structure came into view as they crested the hill, still impressive from a distance, though a closer look revealed the wear of neglect. The roof needed repairs, the paint was peeling, and the once manicured grounds had grown wild without proper attention. This house had been built by Jackson's great-grandfather, Thomas Cole, a man who'd come west with nothing but determination and vision. Through decades of hard work and smart decisions, the Coles had built Blue Mesa into one of the most respected cattle operations in northern Arizona. Now, less than a century later, it would be lost under Jackson's watch. Inside, Jackson washed the dust from his hands and face before settling at the kitchen table to properly review the foreclosure documents. The sum required to stop the proceedings stared back at him from the page, $347,000, an impossible amount. He'd already exhausted all conventional options. The bank had refused further extensions. His application for an agricultural emergency loan had been denied due to unfavorable market projections, bureaucratic language for, "We don't think you'll ever be able to pay us back." Even his attempt to sell off a parcel of the land had fallen through when the prospective buyer discovered water rights issues. Jackson rubbed his tired eyes and reached for the whiskey bottle in the cabinet above the sink. It was barely noon, but some days called for exceptions. He poured 2 fingers into a glass and took a slow sip, the burn a welcome distraction from the weight pressing down on his chest. The sudden ringing of the landline startled him. Few people called the ranch house these days, most preferring to reach him on his cell phone. Jackson picked up the receiver, curious. "Blue Mesa Ranch," Jackson speaking. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "Mr. Cole," came a crisp, professional female voice. "This is Veronica Winters from Morrison and Associates law firm in Phoenix. I'm calling on behalf of our client, Ms. Eleanor Blackwood." Jackson frowned. The name wasn't immediately familiar. "What can I do for you, Ms. Winters?" "Ms. Blackwood has expressed interest in your property and would like to arrange a meeting to discuss a potential business proposition. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon?" A flicker of hope ignited in Jackson's chest, quickly tempered by suspicion. "Is Ms. Blackwood looking to buy land in the area?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of her interest, Mr. Cole. Miss Blackwood prefers to conduct her business matters in person. She's prepared to visit your ranch tomorrow at 2 p.m., if that's convenient for you." Jackson considered this. He was in no position to turn down any potential opportunity, no matter how mysterious. "That would be fine. Should I expect just Ms. Blackwood, or will you be joining her?" "Ms. Blackwood will be accompanied by her personal assistant and driver. I'll remain in Phoenix to prepare any necessary documentation, should your discussions prove fruitful." After ending the call, Jackson stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the ranch that had defined his family for generations. He had no illusions about what this mysterious Ms. Blackwood likely wanted: to buy his land at a fraction of its worth, taking advantage of his desperate situation. Developers from Phoenix were always looking to snatch up struggling ranches, turning working land into vacation homes or resorts for the wealthy. Still, he had few options left. Perhaps he could negotiate terms that would at least allow him to keep a portion of the property or secure employment managing the land for its new owners. It wouldn't be the same as ownership, but it might be better than losing everything. Jackson spent the rest of the day working alongside Miguel, mending fences and checking on the remaining cattle. The physical labor helped clear his mind, though. The impending meeting with Eleanor Blackwood remained at the edges of his thoughts. That evening, he made an effort to clean up the ranch house, clearing away the accumulated clutter of a man living alone and too busy with outdoor work to properly maintain his living space. If he was going to negotiate, he at least wanted to do so from a position of apparent dignity. As he straightened up the study that had once been his father's domain, Jackson paused before the wall of family photographs. 4 generations of Coles stared back at him, stern-faced men and proud women who had weathered hardships from the Great Depression to multiple droughts, always finding a way to persevere. His father, Richard Cole, had been the most imposing of them all, a man whose shadow Jackson had never quite managed to escape. Jackson's mother had died when he was just 12, leaving his father to raise him alone. Richard Cole had been a hard man, but a fair one, teaching his son everything he knew about ranching and responsibility. When a heart attack took him 6 years ago, Jackson had stepped into his role with confidence, certain he could maintain the legacy entrusted to him. He couldn't have foreseen the drought that would begin the following year, or the dramatic drop in cattle prices that coincided with it. Now, the photographs seemed to watch him with judgment rather than pride. "I tried, Dad," Jackson murmured, to his father's stern image. "God knows I tried." The next morning, Jackson was up before dawn, as usual. He spent the early hours handling essential ranch tasks before returning to the house to shower and change. He opted for his best jeans, a pressed Western shirt and his newest hat, respectful but not trying too hard. At precisely 1:55 p.m., a sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled up the long driveway, dust billowing behind it. Jackson stepped onto the porch, squaring his shoulders as the vehicle came to a stop. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a simple, dark suit, emerged first and opened the rear passenger door with practiced efficiency. From the vehicle stepped a tall, elegant woman who defied Jackson's expectations. Eleanor Blackwood appeared to be in her mid-70s, but carried herself with the straight-backed poise of someone decades younger. Her silver hair was styled in a sophisticated bob that framed a face lined with age, but alert with intelligence. She wore a simple but clearly expensive linen pantsuit in a shade of desert sand, accented by a turquoise necklace that suggested appreciation for Southwestern aesthetics rather than tourist fascination. Behind her emerged a younger woman in her early 30s, carrying a leather portfolio and what looked like an oxygen tank on wheels, connected to Miss Blackwood by a thin, clear tube that ran discreetly to her nostrils. Despite this sign of physical vulnerability, there was nothing fragile about Eleanor Blackwood's demeanor as she approached the porch, her gaze taking in the ranch house and Jackson himself with clear assessment. "Mr. Cole," she greeted him, her voice deeper and more resonant than he had expected. "Thank you for accommodating this meeting on such short notice." Jackson descended the porch steps, extending his hand. "Miss Blackwood, welcome to Blue Mesa Ranch." Her handshake was firm and brief. "This is my assistant, Diane Chen," she indicated the younger woman, "and my driver, Marcus." Jackson nodded to both, then gestured toward the house. "Would you like to come inside? It's cooler and I've got fresh lemonade made up." "That would be lovely," Eleanor replied. "Though perhaps before we settle in, you might show me around. The property? I prefer to get a feel for a place before discussing business." Jackson hesitated, glancing at the oxygen tank. "It's pretty hot out, ma'am. Would that be comfortable for you?" A flicker of amusement crossed Eleanor's face. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Cole, but I've never let my physical limitations dictate my actions. The tank comes with me, and Diane is quite adept at managing it. In that case, I'd be happy to show you around. We can take my truck. It's got decent air conditioning." As they settled into Jackson's Ford F-150, Eleanor in the passenger seat, Diane and Marcus in the back with the oxygen equipment, Jackson couldn't help but wonder what exactly had brought this sophisticated older woman to his failing ranch. She didn't strike him as a developer or typical investor. There was something more personal in her interest, evident in the way her keen eyes took in every detail of the landscape as they drove. "How long has your family owned this land, Mr. Cole?" Eleanor asked as they passed through a section of the northern pasture. "Going on 100 years, Jackson replied, pride evident in his voice despite the circumstances. "My great-grandfather purchased the original parcel in 1927, expanded it during the 40s when some neighboring properties went under." "Thomas Cole," Eleanor said with a nod. "He had quite the reputation in his day." Jackson glanced at her, surprised. You knew of my great-grandfather? I make it my business to know the history of things that interest me, she replied simply. The Blue Mesa operation was considered innovative for its time. Your family implemented water conservation methods decades before they became standard practice. Jackson couldn't hide his surprise at her knowledge. Few people outside of ranching circles would know such details about his family's operational history. Eleanor continued, "Of course, even the best water management systems have their limits when faced with a drought of this magnitude." "That's putting it mildly," Jackson agreed, steering the truck toward the eastern boundary, where the land sloped up toward the mesa that gave the ranch its name. "We've had dry spells before, but nothing like these past 3 years. No meaningful rainfall, wells starting to run dry, feed costs through the roof." He pulled the truck to a stop at a vantage point that offered a sweeping view of the ranch. From here, the central complex of house, barn, and outbuildings was visible, as were the parched pastures stretching out in all directions. "It's still beautiful," Eleanor observed, her gaze taking in the vista, "even in its struggle." Jackson cut the engine, and for a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the quiet whir of Eleanor's oxygen concentrator. "Ms. Blackwood," Jackson said finally, turning to face her, "I appreciate the interest in my family history and the tour, but I think we both know why you're here. The ranch is in foreclosure. I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage, and the bank's given me 90 days before they take it all. If you're looking to buy, I'd prefer we discuss terms directly rather than dance around it." Eleanor studied him, her expression unreadable. "Directness. I appreciate that quality, Mr. Cole." "Jackson, please." "Jackson, then." She nodded. "And you're right. I am here because I learned of your financial difficulties, but I'm not interested in buying your ranch." He frowned. "Then what—" "I have a proposition for you," she interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact. "One that would solve your immediate financial problems and potentially secure the future of Blue Mesa for generations to come." Jackson waited, uncertain where this was heading. "I propose marriage," Eleanor stated, as calmly as if suggesting a business merger. For a moment, Jackson was certain he had misheard. He stared at Eleanor, looking for any sign that she was joking, but her expression remained perfectly serious. "Marriage," he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "A marriage of convenience, to be precise," Eleanor clarified. "I would provide the funds to clear your debt and establish capital for ranch improvements. In return, you would provide me with a home for my final years and the legal status of a spouse." Jackson's mind raced to make sense of the proposition. "Ms. Blackwood, Eleanor, we've only just met. I'm 75 years old, Jackson," she finished for him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "And you're concerned this sounds like some sort of bizarre proposition. It is, but it's also entirely practical." From the back seat, Diane cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion at the house, Ms. Blackwood. Your next oxygen treatment is due in 20 minutes. Eleanor nodded. "A sensible suggestion, Diane. Shall we, Jackson?" Still stunned, Jackson started the truck and drove back to the ranch house in silence, his thoughts in turmoil. By the time they were settled in the living room, Eleanor in his father's old armchair, Diane efficiently setting up what appeared to be a portable breathing treatment, and Marcus standing discreetly by the door, Jackson had collected himself enough to address the outlandish proposal. "I don't mean any disrespect," he began carefully, "but I don't understand why someone in your position would suggest something like this. If you wanted to help, why not just offer a loan or investment?" Eleanor's expression remained composed. As Diane fitted a breathing mask over her nose and mouth, she held up one finger, indicating she would respond after the treatment. Jackson waited, watching as the older woman breathed deeply, her eyes closed in concentration. After a few minutes, Eleanor removed the mask and handed it to Diane. "Thank you, my dear," she said, before turning her attention back to Jackson. "A fair question," she acknowledged. "The simple answer is that at my age, with my health conditions, I have little interest in being merely a creditor or silent investor. What I seek is more personal." "I still don't understand," Jackson admitted. Eleanor sighed, settling back in the chair. "I have a certain fondness for this part of Arizona. I spent some of the happiest years of my youth not far from here. As my health has declined, I found myself drawn back to the landscapes that once brought me joy." She gestured toward the window, where the vast expanse of ranch land stretched toward distant mesas. "I've spent the last decade living in a penthouse in Phoenix, surrounded by the best medical care money can buy, but increasingly isolated from the natural world. Before I die, and make no mistake, my doctors give me perhaps 2 years at most, I would like to reconnect with the land." "And you need to marry me to do that?" Jackson asked, still confused. "Surely you could buy any property you wanted." "I could," Eleanor agreed, "but ownership without purpose feels empty at my age. Blue Mesa is a working ranch with history, character, and a legacy worth preserving. You, Jackson, are clearly devoted to this land, but trapped by financial circumstances beyond your control. I offer a solution that benefits us both." She leaned forward slightly. "I have no living heirs, no close family. My substantial estate will eventually go to charitable foundations selected by my legal team. What I'm proposing would direct a portion of that wealth to preserving this ranch, while providing me with a meaningful final chapter." "A marriage of convenience," Jackson said slowly, trying to wrap his mind around the concept. "Precisely. Separate bedrooms, of course. I would bring my medical staff. Diane is not just my assistant, but a trained nurse, and make necessary modifications to the house for my health needs. In return, I would clear your debt, provide capital for improvements, and ensure that upon my death, the ranch and all associated assets would remain with you." Jackson stood and paced to the window, looking out at the land his family had worked for generations. The proposal was bizarre, unprecedented, and yet, faced with the imminent loss of everything, he couldn't simply dismiss it. "This is a lot to take in," he said finally. "Of course it is," Eleanor agreed. "I don't expect an answer today. Diane has prepared a detailed contract outlining every aspect of the arrangement." She nodded to her assistant, who opened the leather portfolio and extracted a thick document. "Take it. Review it. Consult with your attorney if you wish," Eleanor continued. "But I will need your decision within the week. My health doesn't afford the luxury of extended deliberation." Jackson accepted the contract, feeling the weight of the papers in his hands. "How did you even find out about me? About Blue Mesa's situation?" A small smile played at Eleanor's lips. "I have maintained connections in the banking industry from my late husband's business interests. When I expressed interest in potentially acquiring distressed agricultural properties in northern Arizona, your ranch was brought to my attention. Once I researched your family history and the significance of Blue Mesa, I developed this alternative approach." "Your late husband," Jackson echoed. "Was he in ranching too?" Eleanor's smile widened slightly. "No. Heiress and Blackwood built railroads. The Blackwood Continental Line was his legacy, a freight network that connected much of the western United States. I inherited his controlling interest when he died 20 years ago. The name suddenly registered with Jackson. Blackwood Continental was one of the largest freight rail operations in the country. If Eleanor was that Blackwood widow, her wealth would be substantial indeed." As if reading his thoughts, Eleanor added, "The financial aspects of my proposal are easily verified, should you have concerns. My resources are more than adequate to fulfill all promises outlined in that contract." Jackson nodded slowly. I appreciate your directness, Miss Blackwood. I'll review the contract and think about what you're offering. That's all I ask, Eleanor replied, gesturing to Diane to help her stand. We should return to Phoenix now. I've had quite enough. Excitement for one day. As Jackson walked them to the navigator, Eleanor paused before getting into the vehicle. This may seem like an unusual proposition, Jackson, but I believe it could benefit us both greatly. Sometimes salvation arrives in the most unexpected forms. After they departed, Jackson stood in the driveway, watching the dust settle behind their vehicle, the contract still in his hand. The proposition was unprecedented, outlandish even, and yet it represented perhaps his only chance to save the ranch. That evening, after completing the day's remaining chores with Miguel, Jackson sat at his kitchen table, with the contract spread before him, illuminated by the overhead light. The document was comprehensive, detailing everything from financial arrangements to medical accommodations to inheritance provisions. Eleanor Blackwood had thought of every contingency, including possible divorce, which would still leave Jackson with enough to clear his debts, and her own incapacitation, which would trigger certain healthcare directives while maintaining his position. Most significantly, upon her death, full ownership of the ranch and all improvements made during their marriage would transfer to Jackson, along with a substantial trust fund dedicated to the property's ongoing maintenance. The terms were more than generous. They were life-changing. Yet the idea of marrying a stranger, especially one nearly 40 years his senior, felt surreal. What would people in town say? What would Miguel and the ranch's former employees think? Would they see him as a desperate gold digger, willing to sell himself to save his property? Jackson picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would give him honest counsel, his oldest friend, Thomas Garcia, who now practiced law in Flagstaff. When he explained the situation, there was a long silence on the line. "You're telling me Eleanor Blackwood, the railroad heiress, wants to marry you to save your ranch?" Thomas finally asked, his tone caught between disbelief and amazement. "That's the short version, yes," Jackson confirmed. "And you're actually considering it?" Jackson sighed heavily. "The bank's going to take everything in 90 days, Tom. I've tried every other option. This is unconventional as hell, but it might be my only shot at keeping Blue Mesa." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "From a legal standpoint, the contract sounds solid based on what you've described. Blackwood's attorneys know what they're doing. But Jack," he hesitated, "this goes beyond legal considerations. Are you prepared for what this would mean? Living with a stranger, being legally bound to someone you don't know or love?" "I don't know," Jackson admitted, "but I do know what losing this ranch would mean. It's not just land, Tom. It's my family's legacy, my home, my whole life." After hanging up, Jackson stepped onto the porch, looking up at the vast expanse of stars overhead. The night was clear and cool, the air scented with sage and juniper. This land had been in his blood for generations. The thought of it passing into the hands of strangers, perhaps being subdivided or developed, was almost physically painful. Would entering into this unusual arrangement be a betrayal of the Cole family legacy, or the only way to preserve it? Would his father understand, or would he see it as taking the easy way out? Jackson had no answers, only questions that circled in his mind as the night deepened around him. The next morning, he drove into the small town of Verde Crossing, 20 miles from the ranch. He needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed space to think away from the property where every fence post and water trough seemed to watch him. With judgment, at the Mercantile, which served as general store, hardware supplier, and informal community center, Jackson nodded to familiar faces as he gathered his items. News traveled fast in small towns, and several people offered sympathetic comments about the ranch's foreclosure notice, public record that had already made its way through local gossip channels. "Tough break, Jack," said Pete Mendez, who owned the feed store on the edge of town. "If there's anything we can do to help." Jackson appreciated the sentiment, though he knew there was little his neighbors could offer beyond goodwill. Most of the ranching families in the area were struggling themselves, if not to the same degree. As he loaded his purchases into the truck, he spotted Sheriff Ray Williams approaching, his expression concerned. "Morning, Jack," the sheriff greeted him. "Got a minute?" Jackson nodded, leaning against the truck bed. "What's on your mind, Ray?" "Heard you had visitors yesterday," Williams said casually. "Black Navigator, Phoenix plates, everything all right out at Blue Mesa?" News really did travel fast. Someone must have spotted Eleanor's vehicle on the road to the ranch. "Just a potential investor," Jackson replied, not ready to share the full truth. "Nothing settled yet." Sheriff Williams studied him for a moment. "Just be careful, Jack. Times like these, there are folks who prey on people in tough situations. Land scammers, predatory lenders, all sorts coming out of the woodwork. I appreciate the concern," Jackson said sincerely, "but I can handle myself." As he drove back to the ranch, the sheriff's warning echoed in his thoughts. Was that what Eleanor Blackwood was doing, preying on his desperation? The contract seemed legitimate, her attorneys reputable, but the arrangement was so unusual that doubt was natural. When Jackson arrived back at the ranch, he was surprised to find Miguel waiting for him with an urgent expression. "Jefe, you had a call while you were in town," the older man said as Jackson unloaded supplies. "A Ms. Chen. She said it was important. Something about Ms. Blackwood being hospitalized last night." Jackson froze. "Did she leave a number?" Miguel handed him a slip of paper. "She said to call as soon as you returned." Jackson immediately dialed the number, his thoughts racing. If Eleanor had died or become incapacitated, the potential lifeline for Blue Mesa would vanish. Diane Chen answered on the second ring. "Mr. Cole, thank you for returning my call." "I heard Miss Blackwood is in the hospital," Jackson said without preamble. "Is she all right?" "She experienced respiratory distress last night after returning from your ranch," Diane explained, her voice professional but tinged with concern. "She's stabilized now, but the doctors are recommending reduced travel and a less urban environment. Miss Blackwood has requested to speak with you directly if you're willing to come to Phoenix." Jackson hesitated only briefly. "I'll leave right away." "Which hospital?" "Arizona Heart Medical Center. I'll text you the details and meet you in the lobby." 3 hours later, Jackson found himself following Diane through the sterile corridors of one of Phoenix's most exclusive medical facilities. The contrast between the hospital's sleek modernity and his own dusty boots and worn jeans wasn't lost on him. Eleanor Blackwood's private room resembled a luxury hotel suite, more than a typical hospital space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Camelback Mountain, and the medical equipment, while present, was discreetly positioned. Eleanor herself was sitting up in bed, looking more fragile than she had the day before, but still maintaining that air of composed dignity. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and someone, presumably Diane, had helped her apply light makeup. "Jackson," she greeted him, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." "Miss Blackwood," he replied, taking her hand gently. "I'm sorry to hear you've been unwell." Eleanor gestured to a chair beside the bed. "Please sit, and it's Eleanor, remember? If we're to discuss marriage, we should at least be on a first-name basis." Despite the circumstances, Jackson found himself smiling, slightly at her directness. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he took the offered seat. "Like a woman of 75 with progressive pulmonary fibrosis," she replied dryly, "which is to say, increasingly aware of my mortality. The doctors want me on oxygen full-time now, and they've suggested I consider a move to a lower elevation, away from Phoenix's air pollution. She adjusted her position slightly, the movement careful and measured. I fear these episodes will become more frequent in the coming months. All the more reason to make decisions promptly rather than lingering. In deliberation, Jackson nodded, understanding her implication. I've reviewed the contract, he said. It seems thorough, fair even, but I still have questions. I would be concerned if you didn't, Eleanor replied. Ask them. Why marriage specifically? Jackson asked the question that had been bothering him most. Why not some other legal arrangement, a partnership, a living trust, something that doesn't involve this level of personal commitment? Eleanor's gaze was steady. Marriage provides certain legal protections and privileges that other arrangements do not, particularly regarding medical decisions and inheritance. It also offers a clarity of intention that I find appealing at this stage of my life. She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. There is also, I admit, a certain personal element to my choice. I was married to Harrison for 43 years. I found value in the institution, despite its challenges. To spend my final years with a legal partner rather than surrounded by paid caregivers holds a certain appeal. But we're strangers, Jackson pointed out. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged, and we would likely remain something like strangers in many ways. I harbor no romantic illusions, Jackson. What I seek is companionship of a particular kind, someone with integrity, someone connected to the land I've always loved, someone who would benefit from what I can offer as much as I would benefit from what they provide. Her directness was almost startling, but Jackson appreciated it. There was no pretense in Eleanor Blackwood, no attempt to disguise her proposition as anything other than what it was. A practical arrangement between two people with complementary needs. The town. We'll talk, Jackson said after a moment. People will assume the worst about my intentions. People always talk, Eleanor replied dismissively. Let them. We would know the truth of our arrangement. She studied him thoughtfully. You're worried about your reputation. That's understandable. But consider this. Would you rather be the man who made an unconventional choice to save his family legacy, or the man who lost everything because he was too proud to accept help on unusual terms? The question struck at the heart of Jackson's struggle. Pride had always been the Cole family's strength, and sometimes its weakness. I need to know one more thing, he said finally. Why me specifically? Why Blue Mesa? There must be dozens of struggling ranches you could have approached. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a softening perhaps, or a glimpse of something more personal than she had yet revealed. Let's just say I have my reasons, she replied. Some business, some personal. If you accept my proposal, perhaps, I'll share them with you someday. She reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, and Jackson instinctively moved to help her. As she took a sip, her hand trembled slightly, a reminder of her frailty despite her commanding presence. You don't have to decide this moment, Eleanor said, setting the glass down. But I would like an answer within 48 hours. My medical team is advising adjustments to my living situation as soon as possible. Jackson nodded, standing to leave. I understand. You'll have my decision tomorrow. As he turned to go, Eleanor called after him. Jackson, whatever you decide, know that your integrity is evident in how seriously you're considering this matter. Your family would be proud of that, regardless of your final choice. The drive back to Blue Mesa gave Jackson time to think. Eleanor's words about family pride resonated deeply. Would his father understand the choice he was contemplating? Richard Cole had been a traditionalist in many ways, but also pragmatic when circumstances demanded it. Land is forever, son, his father had often said. Money comes and goes, people live and die, but the land remains. Our job is to steward it for the next generation. There was no next generation for Jackson, no wife, no children to inherit Blue Mesa. He'd been so focused on keeping the ranch going that building a family of his own had always seemed like something to consider later. A later that never quite arrived. By the time he returned to the ranch, night had fallen. Miguel had left dinner warming in the oven, a simple but thoughtful gesture that reminded Jackson of how few people remained in his life who truly cared about his welfare. After eating, he sat on the porch with his father's old journal open in his lap. Richard Cole had kept meticulous records of ranch operations, but occasionally interspersed among the cattle counts and rainfall measurements were more personal reflections. Jackson turned to an entry from the drought of 1989, searching for wisdom from the past. "Hardest decision of my life today," his father had written. "Sold the east parcel to keep the rest afloat. My father would have called it failure. Perhaps it is. But sometimes survival requires sacrifice. Better to lose a finger than the whole hand." The parallel wasn't exact, but the principle was the same. Sometimes preserving what matters most requires difficult, even painful choices. As dawn broke the next morning, Jackson had made his decision. He called the number Diane had provided and asked to speak with Eleanor. "I'll do it," he said simply when she came on the line. "I accept your proposal." The relief in Eleanor's voice was evident. "I'm pleased to hear that, Jackson. Diane will make all the necessary arrangements. We can proceed with the ceremony as soon as my doctors clear me for discharge, likely within 3 to 4 days." So soon? Jackson hadn't expected things to move quite that quickly. "At my age and in my condition, Jackson, time is a luxury." "I cannot afford to waste," Eleanor replied. "Is that timeline problematic for you?" Jackson thought about the foreclosure clock ticking down, about the nearly empty bank account and mounting bills. "No," he said finally. "It's not problematic. I'll be ready." The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Jackson informed Miguel of the upcoming changes, explaining as much of the arrangement as seemed necessary. The older man listened without judgment, nodding slowly. "Life takes strange turns, Jefe," was all he said. "If this saves Blue Mesa, then God has worked in mysterious ways indeed." Diane coordinated everything with frightening efficiency. A justice of the peace was arranged. Eleanor's medical equipment and personal belongings would be transported to the ranch. Contractors would arrive. The Diane coordinated everything with frightening efficiency. A justice of the peace was arranged. Eleanor's medical equipment and personal belongings would be transported to the ranch. Contractors would arrive the day after the ceremony to begin necessary modifications to accommodate Eleanor's health needs, a stair lift, bathroom renovations, enhanced air filtration systems, and a small medical suite for her ongoing treatments. Jackson spent those days in a strange emotional state, alternating between pragmatic acceptance of his decision and moments of disbelief at the path he was taking. He cleaned the house thoroughly, cleared out the master bedroom for Eleanor's use, and moved his belongings to a smaller room down the hall. The ranch had plenty of space. The house had been built for a large family that never materialized. He also made a point of visiting his parents' graves in the small Verde Crossing cemetery, seeking some form of blessing or at least absolution for his unconventional choice. Standing before the weathered headstones, Jackson explained his decision, as if his parents could hear him. "It's the only way to save the ranch," he said quietly. "I know it's not what you would have expected or wanted for me, Dad, but it's what has to be done." A warm breeze stirred the desert wildflowers he'd placed on the graves, and Jackson took it as a sign, if not approval, at least acceptance. The night before the wedding, Thomas Garcia drove out from Flagstaff, insisting on seeing his friend before the ceremony. "You sure about this, Jack?" Thomas asked as they sat on the porch, beers in hand. "Once you sign those papers, there's no easy way back." Jackson gazed out at the darkening landscape, the familiar silhouette of the mesas outlined against the twilight sky. "I'm sure about saving Blue Mesa," he replied honestly. "Everything else is secondary." Thomas studied his friend's profile. "You know, people are already talking. Word's gotten around about Eleanor Blackwood and her interest in your ranch. The speculation is pretty wild." "Let them talk," Jackson said, echoing Eleanor's dismissive words. "The truth is strange enough, without their embellishments." "And you're comfortable with the terms of the contract? My offer to review it still stands." Jackson shook his head. "I've gone through it line by line. It's more than fair. Her lawyers have thought of everything. My rights, her care requirements, what happens in case of divorce or her death. Blue Mesa's future is secured, no matter what." Thomas nodded slowly, then raised his beer bottle. "Then, here's to unconventional solutions and the courage to pursue them." The wedding itself was a small, practical affair. The justice of the peace arrived at Blue Mesa mid-morning, followed shortly by Eleanor in the Navigator, accompanied by Diane, Marcus, and a registered nurse named Paul, who would be part of her live-in care team. Eleanor looked elegant despite her obvious frailty, dressed in a simple ivory suit with a silk scarf that complemented her silver hair. She wore an oxygen cannula, but it somehow seemed like just another accessory, incorporated seamlessly into her dignified appearance. Jackson had opted for his best Western suit, the one he reserved for important livestock auctions and rare social events. Miguel stood as his witness, while Diane served as Eleanor's. The ceremony took place in the ranch house living room, with its panoramic views of the landscape that had drawn both families to this land. The justice of the peace kept things brief and straightforward, adapting the traditional vows to focus on mutual respect and support rather than romantic love. A thoughtful touch that Jackson appreciated. When it came time to exchange rings, Eleanor surprised Jackson by presenting him with a simple platinum band. "It was Harrison's," she explained quietly. "If it makes you uncomfortable, you needn't wear it." Jackson hesitated only briefly before accepting the ring. The gesture seemed important to Eleanor, and he was determined to honor the spirit of their agreement, strange as it might be. In return, he offered her his mother's ring, a modest diamond set in gold that he'd kept in his father's old safe. "She would have wanted it to be worn," he said simply. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she allowed Jackson to slide the ring onto her finger, which was thin enough that the band fit loosely. The moment held an unexpected poignancy, a recognition of the history and legacy they both carried. "By the power vested in me by the state of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice concluded. "You may seal your union with a kiss." Jackson leaned down awkwardly, intending a brief, respectful kiss on Eleanor's cheek. But she turned slightly at the last moment, meeting his lips with her own in a gentle but deliberate contact that lasted just long enough to fulfill the tradition. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she said softly as they separated, the formality contrasting with the intimacy of the moment they'd just shared. "Mrs. Cole," he replied with a slight nod, the new name sounding strange to his ears. Eleanor's mouth quirked. In a small smile, "I believe I'll keep Blackwood professionally, but Cole will do nicely for personal matters." With the ceremony complete, the justice departed, and an efficiently organized late lunch followed. Diane had arranged catering from Verde Crossing's best restaurant, a spread of southwestern cuisine that acknowledged local traditions while meeting Eleanor's dietary requirements. As they ate, Jackson found himself studying his new wife, trying to reconcile the reality of their situation with the surreal nature of what had just occurred. Eleanor Blackwood, now technically Eleanor Cole, was a walking contradiction. Physically fragile, yet possessed of iron determination, formally reserved, yet capable of surprising directness, a stranger who was now legally his closest relation. The contractors arrived that afternoon as scheduled. Eleanor retired to rest, while Jackson showed the foreman what needed to be done. The master bedroom and adjoining bathroom would be renovated first, followed by the installation of the stairlift and medical equipment. Until those renovations were complete, Eleanor would stay in the ground floor guest room that had been hastily adapted for her needs. That evening, after Eleanor had gone to bed under Diane's attentive care, Jackson sat alone on the porch, the weight of the day's events finally settling over him. He twisted the unfamiliar ring on his finger, thinking about the strange path that had led him to this moment. In the space of 2 weeks, he had gone from the brink of losing everything to being legally married to one of the wealthiest women in Arizona. The financial aspects of their arrangement had already been set in motion. By morning, the ranch's mortgage would be paid in full, outstanding debts cleared, and a substantial operating fund established in a new joint account. Blue Mesa Ranch was saved, or at least its immediate future was secured. Yet despite this incredible reversal of fortune, Jackson felt an odd hollowness. The victory had come at the cost of personal autonomy, of following the traditional path he had always expected for himself. There would be no conventional marriage now, no children to carry on the Cole name, no simple continuation of the life he had planned. Instead, he had tied his future to an elderly, ailing woman he barely knew, committing to care for her through her final years in exchange for financial salvation. It was a fair bargain, perhaps even a merciful one for both parties, but it was not the future he had envisioned. As darkness fell over the ranch, Jackson finally went inside, moving quietly through the now unfamiliar space. Contractors had already begun rearranging furniture and marking walls for renovation. Medical equipment hummed softly from the guest room where Eleanor slept. In the kitchen, Diane was preparing medications for the next day, while Paul reviewed care protocols. This was his home now, his and Eleanor's. The thought was still strange, but as Jackson climbed the stairs to his new bedroom, he found himself accepting it with growing resolution. He had made his choice, and he would honor it with the same determination that had carried the Cole family through previous hardships. The next morning, Jackson rose before dawn, as was his habit. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, intending to check on the cattle before the day's activities began in earnest. To his surprise, he found Eleanor already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, oxygen tank discreetly positioned beside her chair. "Good morning," she greeted him, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day. "You're an early riser, I see." "Ranching habit," Jackson replied, moving to the coffee maker. "Did you sleep well?" "As well as can be expected in new surroundings," Eleanor said. "Diane tells me you're planning to check the herd this morning?" Jackson nodded, pouring his coffee. "Just a quick ride to the north pasture. I moved them there yesterday since the grass is a bit better. I should be back before the contractors arrive." "Would you mind if I joined you?" Eleanor asked, surprising him. "Not on horseback, obviously, but perhaps in the truck. The doctor recommended morning air, and I'd like to see more of the property now that it's ours." The possessive pronoun hung between them, a reminder of their new legal reality. "Of course," Jackson agreed after a moment's hesitation. "If you're sure you're up for it. It can be rough going in some spots." Eleanor's eyes lit with something like amusement. "I may be dying, Jackson, but I'm not made of glass. A bumpy truck ride won't shatter me." Her directness startled a small laugh from him. "Fair enough. We'll leave in 20 minutes if that suits you." As Jackson prepared for the morning check, he found himself oddly energized by the prospect of showing Eleanor more of the ranch. Despite the unconventional nature of their relationship, there was something appealing about sharing Blue Mesa with someone who seemed genuinely interested in the land and its operations. When they set out in his truck, Eleanor wore a light jacket against the morning chill, her oxygen tank secured in the back seat. She sat tall in the passenger seat, her gaze taking in the landscape with evident appreciation as they drove across the property. "Tell me about your cattle operation," she requested as they bumped along the dirt track. "Before the drought, how many head were you running?" "About 400, Jackson replied, impressed by her use of proper terminology. "Mostly Black Angus with some Hereford crosses. We were known for quality rather than quantity, grass-fed, sustainably raised beef that commanded premium prices." "And now?" "Down to about 120, he admitted. "Had to sell off most of the herd when feed prices spiked and the pastures dried up. Those that remain are my best breeding stock, the foundation for rebuilding once conditions improve." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And with adequate capital, how long would it take to restore the operation to its previous scale?" Jackson considered this. "Assuming normal rainfall returns, 3 to 5 years, probably. Longer if we continue in drought conditions. But you have plans for adaptation, water conservation measures, drought-resistant forage crops?" Again, Jackson was struck by her knowledge of ranching matters. "Yes, actually. My father started implementing some water-saving techniques years ago, but we never had the capital to fully develop the system he envisioned. With proper investment, we could expand water storage, install more efficient irrigation, maybe even drill a deeper well to tap the aquifer more effectively." As they reached the north pasture, the cattle came into view, sleek black forms grazing in the distance, the early sunlight casting long shadows behind them. Jackson parked on a small rise that offered a good vantage point. "They're beautiful," Eleanor commented, watching the animals with genuine interest. "Healthy, despite the challenges." "They're survivors," Jackson agreed, a note of pride in his voice. "Like the Cole family." Eleanor turned to study him, her gaze thoughtful. "And like the Blackwoods in their way. Perhaps that's something we share, despite our different backgrounds." The observation created an unexpected moment of connection between them, a recognition of common ground that transcended their disparate ages and circumstances. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the cattle and the sunrise, painting the mesas in brilliant orange and gold. It was a perfect Arizona morning, the kind that reminded Jackson why he loved this land so fiercely, despite its challenges. "My husband would have appreciated this view," Eleanor said suddenly. "Harrison was a businessman through and through, but he had an unexpected appreciation for natural beauty. It's why he insisted our rail lines minimize environmental disruption whenever possible, even when it cost more." Jackson glanced at her, surprised by the personal revelation. "How long were you married?" 43 years, Eleanor replied, a hint of sadness coloring her voice. "From the time I was 22 until his death at 70, a lifetime, really." "You must miss him," Jackson said, then immediately wondered if the comment was too personal. Eleanor didn't seem to mind. "Every day, but grief changes with time. The sharp pain dulls to a kind of companionable absence. Harrison is gone, but the life we built remains. The railroads still run. The charitable foundations we established still operate. And I'm still here, making decisions he would have understood, if not always approved of." She turned to Jackson with a small smile. "He would have thought this arrangement quite scandalous, I suspect. Harrison was rather traditional in some ways, but he was also practical. Capital must be deployed effectively, he used to say. I believe saving Blue Mesa qualifies." The personal glimpse into Eleanor's previous life humanized her in a way that Jackson hadn't expected. She wasn't just a wealthy benefactor or a business proposition. She was a woman with a history, with loves and losses of her own. As they drove back to the ranch house, Jackson found himself sharing more about his own family history, his mother's early death from cancer, his father's stoic raising of a son alone, the traditions and values that had shaped the Cole legacy. At Blue Mesa, By the time they returned, the contractors had arrived and were unloading materials in the driveway. The day ahead would be filled with renovation noise and decisions, the practical reality of their new arrangement taking physical form. Before they went inside, Eleanor paused, placing a hand lightly on Jackson's arm. "Thank you for this morning," she said simply. "It's been a long time since I've watched a sunrise in good company." The sincere gratitude in her voice touched something in Jackson. Perhaps this strange marriage would offer unexpected moments of connection, even if it wasn't based on the conventional foundations of love and romantic partnership. "Any time," he replied, and meant it. The next 2 days fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Eleanor spent mornings with Jackson, learning about the ranch operations and discussing potential improvements. Afternoons were dedicated to her, medical treatments and rest, while Jackson worked with Miguel and the contractors to adapt the house to Eleanor's needs. The renovations proceeded quickly, funded by Eleanor's seemingly limitless resources. By the evening of their 3rd day as husband and wife, the master bedroom and bathroom had been transformed into a space that accommodated Eleanor's medical requirements while maintaining the ranch house's rustic character. The stair lift had been installed, air filtration systems were operational, and the small medical suite was equipped with everything Diane and Paul might need for Eleanor's ongoing care. Throughout these busy days, Jackson found himself increasingly impressed by Eleanor's resilience and adaptability. Despite her failing health, she approached each day with determination and genuine interest in her new surroundings. She learned the names of all the ranch hands Jackson had been able to rehire thanks to her financial support. She studied maps of the property, asking insightful questions about water resources and grazing rotations. And most surprisingly, she seemed to genuinely enjoy Jackson's company, engaging him in conversations that ranged far beyond the practicalities of their arrangement. For his part, Jackson discovered that caring for Eleanor felt less like an obligation and more like a natural extension of his sense of responsibility. He found himself noticing when she needed rest before she admitted fatigue, learning which positions eased her breathing, and anticipating her needs with growing intuition. On the evening of the 3rd day, after Eleanor had retired for the night, Jackson decided to unpack some of her personal items that had arrived that afternoon. Diane had been called away to deal with a delivery of medical supplies, and Jackson volunteered to organize Eleanor's books and personal mementos in the newly renovated master bedroom. As he carefully arranged leather-bound volumes on the bookshelves, Jackson was struck by the eclectic nature of Eleanor's library: railroad histories, shared space with classical literature, medical texts, and books on Western landscapes. He found himself pausing occasionally to examine particular titles, gaining insights into his new wife's interests and intellect. Among the books was a collection of photograph albums, which Jackson set aside, unsure if Eleanor would want them displayed or stored more privately. As he did so, something fell from between 2 albums, a small brass key attached to a leather tag stamped with the initials EB. Jackson picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It appeared old, possibly even antique, with an intricate pattern carved into its head. The leather tag was worn but well preserved, suggesting the key had been handled regularly over many years. Curious, Jackson set the key on Eleanor's bedside table, where she would be sure to see it, assuming it had simply been misplaced among her belongings during the move. He continued unpacking, organizing the remaining books and arranging several framed photographs on the dresser, mostly images of Eleanor with a distinguished-looking man who must have been Heiress Blackwood, captured at various ages and locations throughout their long marriage. One photograph in particular caught Jackson's attention: a much younger Eleanor, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a striking rock formation that looked strangely familiar. He studied it closely, realizing with a start that the background appeared to be Blue Mesa itself, or at least a very similar landscape in the vicinity. Before he could examine it more closely, he heard Diane returning and set the photograph back in place. The coincidence was curious, but perhaps not surprising given Eleanor's mentioned fondness for this part of Arizona. Later that night, Jackson found himself unable to sleep, his mind circling around the day's events and the strange new reality of his married life. The house felt different with Eleanor and her staff in residence, less empty certainly, but also charged with a new energy and purpose. After tossing and turning for an hour, he decided to head downstairs for a glass of water and perhaps a brief step outside to clear his head. As he descended the newly installed stairlift track, he was surprised to see a light on in the study, a room that had remained largely untouched by the renovations. Approaching quietly, Jackson found Eleanor sitting at his father's old desk, examining what appeared to be architectural drawings by the light of a single lamp. She was alone, without her usual oxygen tank, suggesting she felt strong enough to forgo it temporarily. "Eleanor?" he called softly from the doorway, not wanting to startle her. "Is everything all right?" She looked up, seemingly unsurprised by his appearance. "Jackson, I hope I didn't wake you." "No, I couldn't sleep," he admitted, stepping into the room. "Should you be without your oxygen?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "I can manage short periods without it, especially when seated. Sometimes the cannula irritates my skin, and I need a break from it." Jackson nodded, then gestured to the papers spread across the desk. "What are you working on so late?" "Coming to a decision," Eleanor replied cryptically. She seemed to consider something for a moment, then gestured to a chair across from her. "Since you're awake, perhaps this is the right time for a conversation I've been postponing." Intrigued, Jackson took the offered seat, noting the seriousness in Eleanor's expression. "I found your key earlier," he mentioned. "It fell from between some albums. I left it on your bedside table." "Ah, yes. I wondered where that had gone." Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of one of the drawings. "Actually, that key is part of what I wanted to discuss with you." She carefully gathered the papers into a neat stack, then met Jackson's gaze directly. "You've been wondering why I chose Blue Mesa specifically, haven't you? Why I proposed this unusual arrangement rather than simply purchasing another property or making a straightforward investment in your ranch?" "The thought has crossed my mind," Jackson acknowledged, his curiosity piqued. Eleanor nodded as if having expected this response. "I told you I spent some of the happiest years of my youth in this region. What I didn't tell you is that my connection to Blue Mesa goes much deeper than mere appreciation for the landscape." She slid one of the drawings toward him, what appeared to be an architectural rendering of the ranch house, but with significant differences from its current configuration. Most notably, the plans showed a substantial basement level that, to Jackson's knowledge, didn't exist. "What am I looking at?" he asked, studying the detailed drawings with growing confusion. "The original plans for Blue Mesa Ranch," Eleanor replied, "as designed by my grandfather Edward Blackwood in 1926. Jackson looked up sharply, stunned by this revelation. "Your grandfather? But my family has owned this land since 1927. My great-grandfather, Thomas Cole, purchased it from the Blackwood estate following Edward's death," Eleanor finished for him. "Yes. What the property records don't show is that Edward Blackwood and Thomas Cole were business associates and friends." She pulled another document from the stack, a faded photograph showing two men standing proudly in front of the partially constructed ranch house. One was clearly a younger version of the Thomas Cole who appeared in Jackson's family photographs. The other was a distinguished man with the same sharp features visible in Eleanor herself. "My grandfather was a railroad engineer with a passion for architecture," Eleanor explained. "He designed this house as a retreat, a place to retire away from the industry that had consumed his professional life. But he died before it could be completed, a heart attack at age 52. His widow, my grandmother, had no interest in living, so far from civilization, and sold the property to Thomas Cole, who had partnered with Edward on several business ventures. Jackson struggled to process this information. Nothing in his family's records or stories had ever suggested that Blue Mesa had belonged to anyone but the Coles. Why wouldn't my family have mentioned this? I suspect because the transfer wasn't entirely businesslike, Eleanor said carefully. According to family documents I discovered after Harrison's death, my grandmother sold the property to Thomas Cole for a fraction of its worth, partly out of respect for his friendship with Edward, and partly because she wanted to be done with the painful reminder of her husband's unfinished dream. She pulled out another document, a deed of sale with a purchase price that, even accounting for inflation, was indeed remarkably low. But this still doesn't explain why you've come back now after all these years, Jackson pressed, trying to make sense of this unexpected connection. Eleanor's expression grew more serious. Because there's something about Blue Mesa that very few people know. Something my grandfather built into the very foundations of this house. Something that by rights belongs to both our families. She reached into her robe pocket and withdrew the brass key Jackson had found earlier. This key opens a vault beneath this house, a vault that hasn't been accessed in nearly a century. Jackson stared at the key, then back at Eleanor, disbelief evident in his expression. A vault? In my house? That's impossible. I've lived here my entire life. I would know if there was some secret room or basement. Not if the entrance was deliberately concealed, Eleanor countered. Edward Blackwood was notoriously secretive about certain aspects of his wealth. The turbulent economic conditions of the 1920s made many wealthy individuals cautious about conventional banks. My grandfather was no exception. She slid another drawing across the desk, a detailed rendering of what appeared to be a hidden door mechanism built into the study's fireplace surround. According to my grandfather's journals, which I discovered among Harrison's papers after his death, Edward constructed a secure vault beneath the main house during its initial construction. The entrance was disguised as part of the stone fireplace, with a mechanism designed to reveal itself only when activated by this specific key. Jackson looked from the drawings to the massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the study, a feature that had always been part of the house in his experience, unchanged since his childhood. What exactly is supposed to be in this vault? He asked, still skeptical but increasingly intrigued. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. That's what I came here to discover. The journals mention significant assets placed in safekeeping, but provide no inventory. Given my grandfather's position in the railroad industry and his connections to various mining operations throughout the West, it could be anything from stock certificates to gold bullion. She paused, her expression growing more intense. What I do know is that Edward intended the contents to be shared between the Blackwood and Cole families. His journal contains a letter addressed to both his wife and Thomas Cole, instructing that the vault remain sealed until certain financial conditions were met, conditions that were rendered moot by the Great Depression and subsequent events. And you believe this vault still exists? That it hasn't been discovered or emptied in all these years? Jackson couldn't keep the doubt from his voice. I believe my grandfather was an exceptional engineer who designed systems meant to endure, Eleanor replied simply. And I believe that if Thomas Cole honored his friend's wishes, as all evidence suggests he did, then the vault remains untouched, waiting for our families to reclaim its contents together, as Edward intended. She held out the brass key, offering it to Jackson. "That's the real reason I came to Blue Mesa, Jackson. Not just to save your ranch or secure myself a peaceful final chapter. I came to fulfill my grandfather's legacy and to right an historical oversight that left your family with the land, but potentially denied you part of its intended inheritance." Jackson stared at the key, his mind reeling with the implications of Eleanor's story. If true, it would rewrite not just his understanding of Blue Mesa's history, but possibly its future as well. "And our marriage?" he asked quietly. "Was that just a means to gain access to the property?" Eleanor's expression softened. "The marriage serves multiple purposes, all of them sincere. I truly did want to spend my remaining time in this landscape. I genuinely wished to save Blue Mesa from foreclosure. And yes, I wanted the legal right to search for my grandfather's vault without complications. But I could have simply told you this story and offered a partnership without marriage." She met his gaze directly. "I chose marriage because it honors the relationship between our families that began nearly a century ago. A relationship based on trust, mutual benefit, and shared vision for this land." Edward Blackwood and Thomas Cole were more than business associates. They were friends who believed in each other's integrity. Our marriage continues that connection in a way I believe they would have approved. Jackson slowly reached out and took the key, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic, in his palm. Whatever else might be true about his unusual marriage to Eleanor Blackwood, this tangible connection to Blue Mesa's hidden history demanded exploration. "Show me," he said simply. Eleanor smiled, a look of relief and anticipation crossing her face. "Help me to the fireplace," she requested, rising from the desk with careful movements. "It's time the Blackwoods and Coles discovered what Edward left for us both." Jackson moved to Eleanor's side, offering his arm as she rose from the chair. Despite her frailty, there was an unmistakable energy in her movements now, a sense of purpose that seemed to temporarily transcend her physical limitations. Together, they approached the massive stone fireplace that dominated the study wall. Jackson had grown up with this architectural feature as the centerpiece of the room, never questioning its imposing size or elaborate stonework. Now, viewing it through the lens of Eleanor's revelation, he began to see details he'd overlooked his entire life. The fireplace surround extended nearly 6 feet on either side of the actual firebox, with intricate carved patterns in the stone that he had always assumed were merely decorative. The mantelpiece was a solid slab of Arizona sandstone, its warm red-orange hue complementing the darker grey stones of the surround. "Look at the stonework to the right of the firebox," Eleanor directed, pointing to a section of the carved pattern. "Do you see how the swirls form a circular design about eye level?" Jackson studied the area she indicated. What he had always taken for abstract decoration did indeed form a more deliberate pattern in that section. Concentric circles carved into the stone, the innermost no larger than a quarter. "That's where the key goes," Eleanor explained. "According to my grandfather's journals, the circle contains a hidden keyhole designed to be nearly invisible unless you know exactly what to look for." Jackson ran his fingers over the stone, feeling the smooth depressions of the carved circles. Near the center, his fingertip caught on something, a tiny depression that wasn't immediately visible but could indeed accommodate the ornate head of the brass key. "I feel it," he confirmed, a flutter of excitement rising in his chest despite his lingering skepticism. "But even if there is a keyhole, that doesn't mean it still works after all these years." "There's only one way to find out," Eleanor replied, her voice steady but tinged with the same anticipation Jackson felt. "Edward Blackwood built railroads designed to last centuries. I doubt he would have been less thorough with something he intended to protect his legacy." Jackson raised the key to the small depression, surprised to find that it aligned perfectly with the carved pattern. The brass key slid into the hidden keyhole with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been maintained rather than abandoned for decades. "Should I turn it?" Jackson asked, suddenly aware that they were potentially moments away from discovering something that could change everything he thought he knew about his family home. Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the fireplace with an intensity that made her seem younger, more vital. "This is why I came here, Jackson. This is what our families were meant to discover together." Taking a deep breath, Jackson turned the key clockwise. For a moment, nothing happened, and he felt a stab of disappointment. Perhaps the mechanism had failed after all these years, or perhaps Eleanor's grandfather's journals had exaggerated. Then came a soft click from within the stonework, followed by a low mechanical hum that seemed to emanate from behind the massive fireplace. The sound grew louder, and Jackson felt a vibration through the floor beneath his feet. "Step back," he instructed, gently guiding Eleanor away from the fireplace. They watched in astonishment as the entire right side of the fireplace surround, a section approximately 3 feet wide by 7 feet tall, began to recede into the wall, then slide sideways, revealing a dark opening and what appeared to be a narrow staircase descending into shadows. "My God," Jackson breathed, stunned by the engineering feat they had just witnessed. "It's real. All these years, it was right here." Eleanor's face was illuminated with vindication and wonder. "Edward's vault," she whispered, just as he described it. The revealed opening emanated a rush of cool, dry air, suggesting a substantial space below. From what Jackson could see, the staircase was constructed of concrete, with metal handrails on both sides, practical and durable, designed for stability rather than aesthetics. "We should get a flashlight," Jackson said, his practical nature asserting itself through the shock of discovery. Eleanor nodded. "There's a powerful one in my medical kit, and perhaps you should retrieve your father's old revolver from the gun and cabinet. We don't know what we might encounter down there after all these years." Jackson raised an eyebrow at this unexpected suggestion, but had to admit the precaution made sense. He helped Eleanor to a chair, then quickly gathered the flashlight from her room and his father's .38 revolver from the locked cabinet in the hallway. He checked the cylinder, loaded, as his father had always kept it. When he returned to the study, he found Eleanor had rallied her strength, standing again with the support of her cane, her expression determined. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Jackson asked, concerned about the steep stairs and the unknown conditions below. "I could go first and check it out." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I've waited decades for this moment, Jackson. I'm not sending you down there alone. Just stay close to me on the stairs." Recognizing the steel in her voice, Jackson didn't argue further. He clicked on the flashlight, illuminating the staircase that descended approximately 15 feet before ending at what appeared to be a metal door. The beam revealed no signs of deterioration or wildlife. The sealed space had apparently remained undisturbed all these years. With Jackson supporting Eleanor's elbow, they began their careful descent. The air grew cooler as they moved downward, but remained remarkably dry for an underground space, another testament to Edward Blackwood's engineering foresight. At the bottom of the stairs, they faced a heavy metal door with no visible handle, only another keyhole similar to the one above. Without prompting, Jackson inserted the brass key again, turning it with the same smooth action as before. This time, the response was immediate. A series of metallic clicks as an elaborate locking mechanism disengaged, followed by the door swinging inward on perfectly balanced hinges, revealing the vault beyond. Jackson raised the flashlight, and both he and Eleanor gasped at what its beam revealed. The vault was larger than expected, perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably, but it was the contents that left them speechless. Along one wall stood a row of wooden crates stamped with mint marks and dates from the 1920s. Another wall featured a massive antique safe, its brass fittings gleaming as if recently polished. Bookshelves lined a third wall, filled with leather-bound volumes and document boxes. In the center of the room stood a large oak table, its surface covered with what appeared to be maps, blueprints, and a leather portfolio prominently placed. In the center, most remarkably, the room was dimly illuminated by electric lights that had activated when the door opened, primitive but functional Edison bulbs in brass fixtures that cast a warm glow over the space. He connected it to the main electrical system, Eleanor murmured in amazement, and maintained the connection through renovations and updates all these years. Someone did, Jackson agreed, equally astounded. But who? My father never mentioned this place, never gave any indication he knew it existed. They stepped fully into the vault, the door remaining open behind them. Up close, the wooden crates were even more impressive, each stamped with the official mark of the U.S. Mint and labeled Gold Reserve Bullion, with a date from 1926. Gold, Eleanor breathed, running her fingertips over the nearest crate. The family stories were true. Edward converted a significant portion of his assets to gold before the Depression, concerned about bank stability. Jackson moved to the large safe, examining its ornate dial and handle. Any idea what the combination might be? Eleanor shook her head. Not specifically, though I wouldn't be surprised if it's recorded somewhere in these documents. Edward was methodical. He wouldn't have created a vault with contents that couldn't be accessed. They turned their attention to the oak table in the center of the room. The leather portfolio bore Edward Blackwood's initials, embossed in gold leaf. Eleanor reached for it with trembling hands, untying the leather strap that held it closed. Inside was a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age, but the ink still clear and legible. Eleanor read aloud, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her expression. To those who find this vault, if you are reading these words, then you have discovered what I have hidden beneath Blue Mesa Ranch. My hope is that this discovery has been made jointly by representatives of the Blackwood and Cole families, as was always my intention. Thomas Cole and I began as business associates, but became the closest of friends. When my health began to fail in 1926, it was Thomas who stood by me, who helped me create this sanctuary in the desert where I hope to spend my final years. Fate had other plans, as it often does. What you find in this vault represents more than mere wealth. It is the physical manifestation of a vision Thomas and I shared for this land and for the future of both our families. The gold bullion, 25 crates, 100 troy ounces each, was acquired as security against economic uncertainty. The documents in the safe contain railroad rights, mining claims, and water rights that Thomas and I acquired together. It was our hope that someday our families would join forces to develop these assets for mutual benefit. The blueprints on this table outline our vision for what Blue Mesa could become, not merely a cattle ranch, but a model of sustainable development that honors the natural beauty of this landscape while creating prosperity for generations to come. By agreement with Thomas, this vault was to remain sealed until either 50 years had passed or until representatives of both families discovered it together. Whether by accident or design, you have fulfilled the latter condition. May you use what you find here wisely, with respect for the land and the partnership that created it. Edward Blackwood, January 15th, 1927. Eleanor lowered the letter, her eyes meeting Jackson's. He knew, she said softly. He knew he was going to die, and he created all this as a legacy for both families. Jackson's mind raced, trying to process not just the material wealth they'd discovered, but the implications of the letter. But If Thomas Cole knew about this vault, why didn't he pass that knowledge down? Why would my family live for generations without accessing these resources? Eleanor carefully set the letter down and began examining the other documents on the table. Perhaps because of this, she said, extracting another handwritten document from beneath the blueprints. This paper appeared to be a formal agreement between Edward Blackwood and Thomas Cole, signed and witnessed. Eleanor skimmed it quickly, then summarized for Jackson. It's a covenant. Thomas agreed that the vault would remain sealed, its existence known only to him until the conditions Edward specified were met. In return, Edward arranged for his widow to sell Blue Mesa to Thomas at a fraction of its market value, with the understanding that the land would remain in the Cole family until such time as the vault was discovered. Jackson studied her notes, impressed by the clarity of her thinking and the practical approach to implementation. This wasn't just wealthy fantasy or abstract theorizing. It was a workable business plan rooted in sound agricultural and financial principles. This could work, he said, looking up to meet her gaze. Not just work, transform Blue Mesa into something exceptional. It will work, Eleanor corrected him gently, because we'll make it work together. The simple declaration of partnership settled over Jackson with unexpected weight. Their marriage had begun as a transaction, financial salvation in exchange for comfortable final years. But the discovery of the vault had changed the equation, elevating their relationship to something more meaningful. Joint stewards of a shared legacy, bound by history and common purpose. I need to ask you something, Jackson said after a moment. Now that we've found the vault and secured Blue Mesa's future, does our arrangement change? I'd understand if you wanted to renegotiate terms or even dissolve the marriage. Eleanor finished for him, her expression unreadable. Is that what you want, Jackson? He considered the question seriously. The practical benefits of their marriage remained. Eleanor still needed the care and peaceful surroundings Blue Mesa provided. He still benefited from her business acumen and connections. But there was something more now, an unexpected alignment of purpose that transcended their original agreement. No, he said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I think we work well together, and there's something fitting about a Blackwood and a Cole partnering to bring Edward and Thomas's vision to life, don't you think? Relief flickered across Eleanor's face, quickly replaced by her usual composed expression. I agree. Our arrangement has evolved, certainly, but its foundation remains sound. Besides, she added with a small smile, I've grown rather fond of Blue Mesa, and its current proprietor is not entirely disagreeable company. The dry humor made Jackson laugh, easing the moment's seriousness. High praise indeed from Eleanor Blackwood. I'll take it. Their conversation continued late into the evening, planning and dreaming about Blue Mesa's future with the newfound resources at their disposal. The gold would provide immediate capital. The water rights would ensure long-term sustainability. The mining claims could be developed gradually or held as appreciating assets. Most importantly, they had a blueprint. Not just the literal plans Edward and Thomas had created, but a shared vision that honored the past while embracing modern innovations. Blue Mesa would not just survive, it would become a model operation, showcasing how traditional ranching could adapt to contemporary challenges. As midnight approached, Eleanor finally acknowledged her fatigue, allowing Jackson to help her to her feet. They had made remarkable progress, outlining immediate priorities and longer-term goals for the ranch's transformation. A productive evening, Eleanor remarked as they walked slowly toward the hallway, perhaps the most productive since our unusual partnership began. Jackson nodded in agreement. Finding the vault changed everything, not just financially, but personally too. He hesitated, then added, I'm grateful, Eleanor, not just for the resources, but for bringing this history to light. My family's legacy is richer than I ever knew." Eleanor paused at the door to her room, her expression softening. Edward would be pleased, I think. His friendship with Thomas Cole was important to him, important enough to create a legacy that could only be accessed when our families came together again. We've honored that intention. "And we'll continue to," Jackson promised, the words feeling like a more meaningful vow than those they had exchanged during their civil ceremony days earlier. Eleanor studied his face for a moment, then reached up to touch his cheek briefly, the first truly personal contact she had initiated outside the formal requirements of their arrangement. "Good night, Jackson Cole. Tomorrow we begin writing the next chapter of Blue Mesa's story." As Jackson watched her disappear into her room, he realized that their unusual marriage had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a genuine partnership founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. What had begun as a desperate financial arrangement had become something far more meaningful, the revival of a century-old vision and the foundation for a future neither of them could have created alone. Outside, the desert night had cleared after the storm, stars blazing across the sky with renewed brilliance. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and sage, the distinct perfume of the high desert coming back to life. Standing on the porch before, heading to his own room, Jackson took a deep breath of that revitalizing air. Blue Mesa Ranch had weathered its own drought, its own desperate season. Now, like the land itself, it stood poised for renewal, ready to flourish under the combined care of the Cole and Blackwood legacies, united at last as Edward and Thomas had intended nearly a century before. In that moment, Jackson felt a profound connection, not just to the generations of Coles who had worked this land, but to the Blackwood vision that had helped shape it from the beginning. The two families, linked by friendship, separated by circumstance, and now reunited through an unlikely marriage, would move forward together, honoring the past while building toward a future that would have made both patriarchs proud. The discovery of the vault hadn't just revealed hidden treasure. It had uncovered a shared history and purpose that would guide Blue Mesa Ranch into its next century of existence. And for Jackson Cole, it had transformed a marriage of convenience into something approaching destiny, a partnership meant to be, delayed by decades, but finally fulfilled under the vast Arizona sky. 3 days after saying "I do" to save his ranch, Jackson had found not just material wealth, but something far more valuable. A purpose larger than himself, a legacy deeper than he had imagined, and a partner whose strength complemented his own in ways he never could have anticipated. Some might call it luck or coincidence, but standing under the star-filled sky above land his family had worked for generations, Jackson preferred to see it as the natural culmination of a story that began with two visionary friends nearly a century ago, a story temporarily interrupted but never truly abandoned, waiting all this time for the right moment and the right partnership to continue. The weeks following the discovery of the vault brought dramatic changes to Blue Mesa Ranch. With Eleanor's guidance and the newly available resources, Jackson began implementing the vision that Edward Blackwood and Thomas Cole had outlined nearly a century earlier. The first priority was water infrastructure, the lifeblood of any desert operation. Using the detailed plans from the vault combined with modern technology, they installed a comprehensive water management system that captured and stored the precious rainfall, reduced evaporation, and distributed moisture efficiently throughout the property. The timing couldn't have been better. The unexpected storm that had coincided with their discovery seemed to break the drought pattern, with several more rainfall events following in quick succession. "The land remembers," Miguel had said sagely when the third rainstorm in as many weeks drenched the parched soil. "It knows it's being properly tended again." Jackson had smiled at the older man's mysticism, but couldn't deny the strange synchronicity. It was as if Blue Mesa itself had responded to the renewal of the Blackwood coal partnership, coming back to life after years of dormancy. The financial aspects of their discovery required careful management. After consulting with trusted advisors, including Jackson's friend Thomas from Flagstaff, who was sworn to secrecy about the vault specifics, they established a measured approach to utilizing the gold bullion. Rather than converting it all at once, which might attract unwanted attention and possibly affect local gold prices, they arranged for discrete, phased transactions through established dealers in Phoenix and Las Vegas. The first sale provided immediate capital for the water systems and for rehiring the full ranch staff who had been let go during the financial downturn. The remaining gold would be converted gradually as needed, maintaining a substantial reserve as a hedge against future uncertainties. The mining claims proved even more valuable than initially assumed. A preliminary assessment by a respected geological survey firm confirmed rich copper deposits on 2 of the claim sites, with extraction potential that would be valuable, but not environmentally destructive if properly managed. The water rights to the aquifers were perhaps the most strategically significant assets in the long term, given the Southwest's ongoing water challenges. Through it all, Eleanor's business acumen proved invaluable. Despite her physical frailty, her mind remained sharp, navigating complex negotiations with mining companies, water authorities, and government agencies with the practiced skill of someone who had spent decades in high-level corporate management. "You're a formidable negotiator," Jackson commented one evening, after she had concluded a particularly successful conference call with a mining executive, securing terms for the copper claims that exceeded the industry standard by a significant margin. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face despite the oxygen tubes still necessary for her breathing. "Harrison taught me well. Always negotiate from a position where you can afford to walk away," he used to say. "It's easier to be formidable when you hold the stronger position." "Which we now do," Jackson acknowledged, still adjusting to this fundamental change in circumstance. After years of operating from increasingly desperate positions, the psychological shift to negotiating from strength was almost as significant as the financial reversal itself. The news of Blue Mesa's sudden revival couldn't be kept entirely quiet, of course. In Verde Crossing and the surrounding communities, speculation ran rampant about Jackson's marriage to the wealthy railroad heiress and the ranch's sudden flurry of activity. Equipment deliveries, construction crews, and new staff hirings all pointed to a major injection of capital, though no one outside their small circle knew the true source. Sheriff Williams stopped by about 3 weeks after the vault's discovery, ostensibly to check on road conditions after the recent rains, but clearly curious about the developments. "Quite a turnaround, Jack," he observed, as Jackson showed him the new water catchment system being installed near the main barn. "Seems like that marriage is working out better than some folks expected." Jackson had simply nodded, neither confirming nor denying the implication that Eleanor's wealth was responsible for the changes. It wasn't entirely untrue, after all, just incomplete. "Eleanor shares my vision for what Blue Mesa can become," he said instead, which was absolutely true. "We're building something that honors both our families' legacies." The sheriff had seemed satisfied with this, though Jackson could practically see the gossip spreading through town before Williams's truck had disappeared down the driveway. "Let them talk," he thought, echoing Eleanor's dismissive attitude. The truth was far more interesting than whatever rumors they might concoct. The most meaningful changes, however, weren't the visible improvements to the ranch infrastructure or the stabilized finances, but the evolving relationship between Jackson and Eleanor. What had begun as a purely transactional arrangement, financial, salvation in exchange for end-of-life care, had developed unexpected dimensions. Their shared discovery of the vault and the joint stewardship of Edward and Thomas's legacy had created a bond that transcended their initial bargain. They fell into daily routines that complemented each other's strengths and accommodated Eleanor's health limitations. Mornings were dedicated to ranch operations, with Jackson handling the physical aspects while Eleanor managed communications, financial planning, and strategic decisions. Afternoons typically saw Eleanor resting while Jackson continued outdoor work. Evenings brought them together again in the study, now the symbolic heart of their partnership, where they reviewed progress and planned next steps over dinner or drinks. These evening sessions became something Jackson found himself looking forward to with surprising eagerness. Eleanor was a fascinating conversationalist, her long life and extensive business experience providing perspectives Jackson had never encountered in his relatively isolated ranching existence. She told stories of railroad negotiations spanning continents, corporate mergers worth billions, philanthropic initiatives that transformed communities. In turn, Jackson shared the more intimate knowledge of the land, how to read weather patterns in cloud formations, how different soils affected vegetation growth, how cattle behavior predicted coming changes in climate. "We make quite the complementary team," Eleanor observed one evening, about a month after the vault's discovery. They were reviewing the latest architectural plans for the solar array that would provide renewable power to the entire ranch complex, another element from Edward and Thomas's original vision, updated with modern technology. "I was just thinking the same thing," Jackson admitted, looking up from the blueprints. "You understand numbers and negotiation in ways I never will, while I can tell you which pasture will green up first after rain and which waterways will flood in a heavy storm." "Different forms of wisdom, equally valuable," Eleanor said with a nod. Edward and Thomas must have had a similar dynamic, the railroad engineer and the cattle rancher combining their strengths. This mention of their ancestors, a common theme in their conversations, brought Jackson back to a question that had been nagging at him since the vault's discovery. "I've been wondering," he said, setting aside the blueprints. "The photograph I found among your things that first night, the one of you as a young woman standing near what looked like Blue Mesa. That wasn't a coincidence, was it?" Eleanor's expression turned reflective. "No, not a coincidence. That photograph was taken when I was 23, during the only previous visit I made to this property. My grandmother, Edward's widow, was still alive then, in her 90s. She insisted on showing me this place before she died, though she refused to set foot on the property herself. Too painful, she said." She reached for her water glass, taking a careful sip before continuing. "We parked on the county road, and she pointed out the mesa in the distance. That's where Edward meant us to grow old together," she told me. "The most beautiful place God ever created. It was the only time I ever saw her cry." Jackson listened, fascinated by this personal connection to the property's history. "I took that photograph to remember the moment," Eleanor continued. "Little did I know how significant it would become decades later. When I found Edward's journals after Harrison died, that memory came flooding back." "And you decided to find your way here," Jackson concluded, understanding more clearly now, "to reconnect with Edward's legacy." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "though I never anticipated the full complexity of what that would entail. Marriage to a stubborn rancher wasn't in my original plan." Her eyes twinkled with gentle humor. Jackson smiled at the characterization. "And discovering a fortune beneath my study floor wasn't in mine. Life takes unexpected turns." "Indeed it does," Eleanor said, her expression growing more serious. "Which brings me to something I've been meaning to discuss with you." She reached for a leather portfolio beside her chair, one Jackson recognized as containing her personal documents rather than ranch business. "I've had my attorneys update my will," she said, opening the portfolio and extracting a document. Given recent developments and our evolving partnership, certain adjustments seemed appropriate. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. Discussions of Eleanor's eventual death, however inevitable given her medical condition, always left him feeling strangely unsettled. Their contract had addressed inheritance clearly. Upon her death, the ranch and all improvements would remain with him, while her personal assets would go to her designated charitable foundations. This arrangement had seemed straightforward when they were strangers engaged in a business transaction. Now, with their growing connection, the clinical nature of such planning felt somehow discordant. "That's not necessary," he began, but Eleanor held up a hand, stopping him. "It is necessary, Jackson. My condition hasn't changed. My prognosis remains the same. Whether we speak of it or not, my time is limited. What has changed is the nature of what we're building here together." She laid the document on the table. Between them, "I've established a trust specifically for Blue Mesa's ongoing development. Upon my death, my share of Blackwood Continental Railroad stock, approximately 34% of the company, will be placed in this trust, with you as the primary trustee. The income it generates will ensure the ranch's continued operation and expansion according to our vision, in perpetuity." Jackson stared at the document, stunned by the magnitude of this revision to their arrangement. Blackwood Continental was a multi-billion-dollar corporation. A 34% stake represented wealth far beyond the gold they'd discovered in the vault. Wealth that could guarantee Blue Mesa's prosperity for generations. "Eleanor, I can't accept this," he said finally. "It's too much. Your charitable foundations will still receive the bulk of my estate," she interrupted calmly. "This represents only a portion of my holdings, albeit a significant one. The foundations will be co-trustees, ensuring the resources are managed responsibly. But you, Jackson, will determine how the income is applied to fulfill our shared vision for this land." She leaned forward, her gaze intense despite her physical frailty. "This isn't charity or sentiment. It's the fulfillment of a partnership that began with Edward and Thomas and continues through us. The Blackwood Railroad fortune was built in part on resources extracted from lands like this. It seems fitting that a portion of that wealth should return to the land, helping create a model of sustainable stewardship for the future." Jackson sat back, processing the implications. This went far beyond their original arrangement, transforming what had begun as a temporary solution to his financial troubles into a multi-generational legacy project. "I don't know what to say," he admitted finally. "You don't need to say anything right now," Eleanor replied, her expression softening. "Review the documents with your attorney. Consider what this means for the future of Blue Mesa. We can discuss any concerns or modifications you might suggest." She closed the portfolio, signaling an end to the formal discussion. "In the meantime, we have more immediate matters to address. The agricultural consultant arrives tomorrow to assess the potential for those heritage grain fields Edward and Thomas planned for the eastern slopes." This return to practical business steadied Jackson, giving him time to absorb the enormity of Eleanor's proposed bequest. They spent the remainder of the evening discussing crop rotation strategies and soil preparation, setting aside the weightier matter of inheritance for future consideration. Later that night, unable to sleep, Jackson found himself drawn to the vault again. He descended the stairs and opened the heavy door, now familiar with the mechanisms that had once seemed so mysterious. Inside, the space had been reorganized. Gold crates securely stacked and inventoried, documents properly filed and catalogued. But it retained its aura of historical significance. Jackson moved to the oak table in the center, where they had displayed some of the most visually striking items from the vault's contents. Original hand-drawn maps of Blue Mesa from the 1920s, engineering sketches by Edward Blackwood showing water flow patterns across the property, and photographs of Thomas Cole and Edward together, surveying the land that would become their shared legacy. Looking at these artifacts in the vaults, soft lighting, Jackson felt the weight of history and responsibility pressing upon him. Eleanor's unexpected bequest had raised the stakes of their partnership exponentially. This wasn't just about saving his family ranch anymore. It was about creating something enduring that would honor both their lineages while benefiting the land itself for generations to come. Quite a burden, isn't it? Came Eleanor's voice from the doorway, startling Jackson from his contemplation. He turned to find her standing at the entrance to the vault, oxygen tank beside her, wrapped in a silk robe against the cool underground air. "You shouldn't be down here alone," he said automatically, concern for her health overriding his surprise. "The stairs are manageable with sufficient motivation," she finished for him, moving carefully into the vault. "I saw the light and suspected I might find you here." Jackson moved to help her to a chair they had placed near the table for her use during their documentation sessions. "Couldn't sleep either?" "Sleep becomes less imperative when you recognize how little of it you have left," Eleanor replied, with the blunt pragmatism that characterized her approach to her condition. "I've found I prefer consciousness, even with its discomforts." She gestured to the items displayed on the table. "You're thinking about what I proposed earlier." It wasn't a question, but Jackson nodded anyway. "It changes everything, Eleanor. The scale of what you're suggesting. It's far beyond our original agreement." "Is it?" she asked, her gaze steady. "Our original agreement was that I would provide the resources to save Blue Mesa in exchange for spending my final days here. The resources simply proved more substantial than either of us initially understood." Jackson smiled slightly at this understated characterization of a multi-billion-dollar bequest. "That's one way of looking at it." "What troubles you about it?" Eleanor asked directly. "The responsibility, the public attention it might eventually bring, or something more personal?" Jackson considered this, appreciating her ability to cut straight to the heart of complex issues. "All of those, I suppose, but mostly. It feels like I'm getting far more from this arrangement than you are. You're giving Blue Mesa a future that extends generations beyond my lifetime, while I'm providing you with, a few months of comfortable accommodation. It seems disproportionate." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful as she gazed at the photographs of their ancestors. "You're measuring value incorrectly," she said finally. "What you've given me isn't merely accommodation, Jackson. It's purpose and meaning in my final chapter. It's the opportunity to write a historical oversight and reconnect the Blackwood legacy to this land. It's partnership in bringing to life a vision that might otherwise have remained buried forever." She reached out, touching one of Edward's engineering drawings with gentle fingers. "I spent 43 years married to Harrison, building and maintaining the railroad empire. That was my life's work, and I'm proud of it. But this," she gestured around the vault and, by extension, to Blue Mesa itself, "this feels like my life's purpose, the thing I was meant to complete before I leave this world. How do you measure the value of that?" Her words resonated deeply with Jackson. He understood the distinction she was making between work that fills a life and purpose that gives it meaning. In saving Blue Mesa from foreclosure, he had been focused on preserving his family's physical legacy. Now, with Eleanor, he was discovering its deeper purpose, the vision that had informed its creation from the beginning. "I hadn't thought of it that way," he admitted. "Few people do until they're facing the end," Eleanor replied without self-pity. "Mortality has a way of clarifying priorities." She straightened in her chair, her posture reflecting the business leader she had been for decades. "Now, If you're finished wrestling with philosophical questions for the night, perhaps you could help me back upstairs. Diane will be thoroughly displeased to find me missing from my monitoring equipment." Jackson smiled at her matter-of-fact tone and moved to assist her. As they made their way slowly up the stairs, he found himself studying her profile in the dim light, the elegant bone structure still evident beneath the signs of age and illness, the determined set of her jaw, the bright intelligence in her eyes despite her physical frailty. In that moment, he realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. Eleanor Blackwood was not merely his financial savior or his business partner. She had become his friend, perhaps the most unlikely friend he could have imagined, but a genuine one nonetheless. The thought brought an unexpected warmth, a recognition that their unusual marriage had yielded something neither had anticipated: authentic human connection across the divides of age, background, and circumstance. The following weeks saw Blue Mesa's transformation accelerate. With the water management systems in place and functioning effectively, attention turned to the next phase of Edward and Thomas's vision: diversified agriculture. The agricultural consultant Eleanor had mentioned, a specialist in desert farming techniques from the University of Arizona, spent several days evaluating soil conditions and recommending optimal crops for the eastern slopes, where the original plans had indicated grain fields would thrive. "Your great-grandfather was ahead of his time," the consultant told Jackson as they surveyed the area. "These slopes get morning sun but afternoon shade from the mesa, creating a microclimate that's perfect for certain heritage grains. With modern drip irrigation and proper crop selection, you could create a specialty grain operation that would supply high-end bakeries and restaurants throughout the Southwest." The enthusiasm was contagious. Jackson found himself deeply engaged in researching heritage grain varieties that had once been common in the region but had been largely abandoned in favor of commercial strains. Eleanor connected him with artisanal food networks through her philanthropic contacts, establishing potential markets before the first seeds were even ordered. The cattle operation wasn't neglected amid these new developments. Using a portion of the gold proceeds, Jackson purchased breeding stock to rebuild his herd with carefully selected bloodlines known for their adaptability to desert conditions and efficient feed conversion. Miguel, rejuvenated by Blue Mesa's revival, took charge of training the new ranch hands in the Cole family's traditional approaches to cattle management, supplemented by sustainable practices Jackson had researched. "We're bringing back the best of the old ways while adding the best of the new," Jackson explained to a group of agricultural students who visited from the university, part of an educational outreach program Eleanor had suggested. "It's not about rejecting tradition or blindly embracing innovation. It's about finding the sweet spot where both serve the land's long-term health." His words echoed Eleanor's influence, her balanced perspective that valued both heritage and progress. Although her physical condition continued its gradual decline, requiring longer rest periods and increasingly specialized medical support from Diane and Paul, her mind remained sharp, her vision for Blue Mesa's future unwavering. 3 months after their discovery of the vault, as summer heat gave way to the milder temperatures of early fall, Eleanor suggested they host a gathering at the ranch, a formal introduction of the revitalized Blue Mesa to the community and key stakeholders in their various initiatives. "It's time to bring our vision into the public sphere," she explained during one of their evening planning sessions. "We've secured the foundations. Now we need to build allies and partners for the next phases." Jackson had initially hesitated, still uncomfortable with drawing attention to their unusual situation. But Eleanor's strategic thinking was compelling. "We control the narrative this way," she pointed out, Rather than letting speculation and gossip define what's happening here, we present Blue Mesa's transformation on our own terms as the revival of a historic partnership between our families, aimed at creating a model operation for the next century of southwestern agriculture. When she framed it that way, Jackson couldn't argue with the logic. They set a date in late September when the weather would be perfect for an outdoor gathering, and began preparations. The guest list reflected the breadth of their vision: local ranchers and farmers who could become partners in sustainable practices, university researchers interested in desert agriculture and water conservation, representatives from culinary organizations who might purchase their specialty products, officials from environmental agencies whose support would be crucial for responsible development of the mining claims, and community leaders from Verde Crossing, whose goodwill was essential for Blue Mesa's social integration. For Jackson, who had always preferred the solitude of ranch work to social engagement, the prospect of hosting such an event was daunting. Eleanor, sensing his discomfort, took charge of the planning, engaging a professional events team from Phoenix while ensuring the gathering would reflect Blue Mesa's authentic character rather than imported urban sophistication. No white tablecloths or champagne towers, she instructed the event planner during their initial consultation. We want elegant but appropriate to a working ranch. Local foods, regional wines, perhaps a respected Western band for background music. The environment should encourage substantive conversation, not superficial socializing. "Are you sure you're up to this?" Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice. "I could handle the presentation if you need to rest." Eleanor looked up from her notes, her expression resolute despite the oxygen tubes and medical equipment that now seemed a permanent part of her appearance. "I'm sure. This may be my only opportunity to publicly acknowledge the Blackwood connection to Blue Mesa. I don't intend to miss it." Jackson nodded, understanding the importance this held for her. "I've been thinking about something you said earlier, about controlling our narrative. There's an aspect of our story we haven't discussed how to present." "Our marriage," Eleanor said directly, setting aside her notes. "You're wondering how to explain it to people who will inevitably be curious." "Yes," Jackson admitted. "The truth is so complicated and the practical arrangement so unusual." Eleanor considered this for a moment. "The simplest approach is often best. We tell a version of the truth that research into my family history revealed a connection to Blue Mesa through my grandfather. That this discovery led to conversations with you about reviving the original vision for the property, and that our marriage represents the formal renewal of the Blackwood coal partnership that was intended from the beginning. You make it sound almost romantic," Jackson observed with a small smile. "The best business arrangements often have a touch of romance to them," Eleanor replied, a glint of humor in her eyes. "A shared vision, mutual trust, compatibility of values, these are the foundations of successful marriages and successful partnerships alike. We happen to have combined both." Her pragmatic perspective eased Jackson's concern about how they would present their relationship to the outside world. As with so many aspects of their unusual situation, Eleanor's clear-eyed approach cut through complications to find practical solutions. The day of the gathering dawned clear and perfect, with the characteristic deep blue sky of Arizona autumn arching over Blue Mesa Ranch. The event team had transformed the area between the main house and the renovated barn into an elegant outdoor reception space with native plantings, handcrafted wooden tables and subtle lighting that would come into play as evening approached. Local caterers prepared regional specialties featuring ingredients from neighboring farms, while a respected Santa Fe winery provided selections that complemented the menu. A four-piece Western acoustic ensemble set up near the barn, providing background music that enhanced rather than dominated the atmosphere. By mid-afternoon, guests began to arrive. Jackson, dressed in his best Western formal wear, a tailored black suit with a bolo tie featuring a turquoise stone that had been his father's, greeted arrivals alongside Miguel, who had insisted on serving as informal master of ceremonies for the ranch hands. Eleanor made her entrance later, conserving her limited energy for key interactions. Her appearance drew appreciative murmurs from the assembled guests. Despite her obvious frailty and the discreet oxygen apparatus, she projected an aura of dignified elegance in a turquoise silk ensemble that complemented Jackson's bolo tie, a coordinated detail she had arranged without telling him, creating a visual symbol of their partnership. As the gathering moved into its formal program, Jackson found himself surprisingly comfortable in his role as host. The months of working alongside Eleanor had rubbed off on him, imparting some of her social grace and strategic interpersonal skills. He moved through conversations with government officials, university researchers, and neighboring ranchers with newfound confidence, articulating their vision for Blue Mesa with clarity and conviction. When the time came for their presentation, Jackson helped Eleanor to the small raised platform they had arranged near the barn's entrance. A murmur of respectful attention spread through the crowd as the elderly heiress took her position, standing straight despite her evident physical effort. "Welcome to Blue Mesa Ranch," she began, her voice steady and carrying surprisingly well. Across the gathered audience, "My name is Eleanor Blackwood Cole, and alongside my husband Jackson, I am honored to share with you the revival of a vision nearly a century in the making." The use of her hyphenated married name, the first time she had publicly identified herself this way, sent a clear message about the nature of their partnership. Jackson, standing beside her, felt an unexpected swell of pride at this public acknowledgement of their unusual but increasingly meaningful bond. Eleanor continued, weaving the story of Edward Blackwood and Thomas Cole's original partnership, their shared vision for Blue Mesa as a model of innovative, sustainable desert ranching, and the circumstances that had prevented that vision from being fully realized after Edward's untimely death. Now, through a remarkable convergence of circumstances, and yes, a rather unconventional marriage, that original partnership has been renewed, she said, glancing at Jackson with a genuine smile. The Blackwood resources and the Cole stewardship are once again united in service to this extraordinary landscape. Jackson took over then, outlining the specific initiatives already underway and those planned for the coming years: the water management systems, the Heritage Grain Project, the sustainable cattle operation, the renewable energy installations, and the educational partnerships with regional universities. "What we're creating here isn't just a profitable agricultural enterprise," he explained, his passion for the vision evident in his voice. "It's a living laboratory for addressing the challenges facing Western landscapes in the coming century: water scarcity, climate adaptation, food security, and the preservation of both natural ecosystems and human heritage." As he spoke, Jackson surveyed the faces in the crowd, noticing the growing engagement and interest. These weren't just polite attendees humoring their hosts. They were potential allies, genuinely intrigued by Blue Mesa's transformation. Eleanor concluded their presentation with a clear invitation to partnership. "We don't pretend to have all the answers," she said, her voice showing slight signs of fatigue but her conviction undiminished. "What we have is resources, commitment, and a canvas of extraordinary potential. We invite you, as researchers, practitioners, officials, and neighbors, to join us in creating something meaningful for the generations to come." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. As Eleanor and Jackson moved from the platform to mingle with their guests, they found themselves surrounded by people eager to discuss specific aspects of their vision, offer expertise, or propose collaborations. "I'd say that was a success," Jackson murmured to Eleanor as they momentarily found themselves alone near one of the refreshment tables. "You were right about bringing the vision into the public sphere." Eleanor nodded, though he could see the effort of the presentation had taxed her strength. "Visions need communities to become reality," she said. Edward and Thomas understood that. They were building not just for themselves, but for a future they imagined together. Her words struck Jackson as profoundly true. Blue Mesa had always been more than a family ranch. It was a vision passed through generations, temporarily interrupted but never abandoned, waiting for the right moment and the right partnership to fully emerge. As the evening progressed, and lanterns illuminated the gathering against the backdrop of a spectacular desert sunset, Jackson found himself standing slightly apart, watching Eleanor engage with a group of university researchers despite her evident fatigue. Her determination to make the most of this opportunity to advance their shared vision despite her physical limitations moved him deeply. In that moment, he realized something significant had shifted in his perception of their arrangement. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a practical solution to his financial crisis and her end-of-life wishes, had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. A genuine partnership founded on shared purpose, mutual respect, and most surprisingly, authentic affection. The discovery of the vault 3 days after their wedding had changed everything, revealing not just material resources but a deeper heritage and purpose that bound them together in ways no legal contract could have predicted. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky and Blue Mesa Ranch gleamed with new purpose beneath them, Jackson acknowledged a truth he had never expected. In saving his family legacy through an unconventional marriage to a dying heiress, he had found not just financial salvation, but a newfound sense of meaning, connection, and possibility that transcended their original arrangement. Eleanor caught his eye across the gathering, a questioning look on her face. Jackson smiled and nodded, silently communicating that all was well. Better than well, in fact. Despite all the uncertainties that still lay ahead, her declining health, the challenges of implementing their ambitious vision, the complexities of their unusual partnership, Jackson felt a deep certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, fulfilling a legacy that had waited nearly a century for their unlikely union to bring it to life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.